So this is my basic setup for watercolour painting. Straightforward palette. I tend to use these pans, find them convenient. I do have tubes of watercolour, and I can top up the watercolour if it's starting to run down the pan just by squeezing some out of the tube. But the board I use is the board that I've prepared before, which is a piece of plywood that I've finished with several coats of polyurethane varnish. I don't work flat, I tend to work at an angle, that angle as a minimum, that angle preferred, and even if I'm on a bigger piece where I'm standing, I would have it to nearer to vertical. I find that this kind of angle allows the washers to run down, and I can control, and I have more freedom of movement if I paint in this kind of format. Basically the same as I would for oil painting. Permanent alizarin, cadmium red, cadmium yellow, cadmium lemon, a cool lemon, yellow ochre, cobalt blue, blue ultramarine, cerulean blue, and then an array of odds and ends that just really to fill the pans up. Raw sienna, which is very similar to yellow ochre, and the all essential browns, the burnt sienna that I use extensively. There's a few greens down here which I hardly ever use. You can see this is, I think, terre verte, and it's hardly used at all. I never bother with it. You'll observe that the palette is particularly scruffy. Never really much troubles me. I sort of it soon cleans off. So for basic mixes in terms of portraits, figures, flesh tones, which is what the subject of this little video is all about, really. I use the same mix as I would use, the same base mix that I would use for oil paints. Just clean this scruff out of the palette in this case, because I do for the flesh tones I do want relatively clean colour. In terms of brushes, always go for a brush as big as you can. This is a number 20, and it's a Proline brush, a synthetic bristle made by ProArt, but it actually is quite a nice brush to use, and you can get some really nice big washes on. Something a bit more delicate can be created wash-wise or paint-wise with a brush like this, which is a number 8, and that is a squirrel sable mix, again from ProArt. And I have various smaller brushes, riggers and so on, for more delicate painting, and there's some Chinese brushes as well, which I find to be quite useful for certain kinds of mark making. So for starting off, for a base colour for flesh tones, a dab of cadmium, more of yellow ochre, and a wee touch of cerulean blue will normally get you to a base flesh tone. I'll pause there and raise the paper up to the right angle so that I can show you that the wash works. So this paper that I'm using is 300 grams watercolour paper. Under normal circumstances I would always stretch this weight of paper, but for this particular exercise, since I'm only showing the colours, I can live with the fact that it's going to probably buckle very slightly in the process of this demonstration. It's always as well to have a piece of paper, scrap paper of the same weight, same kind of paper that you're painting on, to one side, because you always need to be testing the strength of the paint on a little test piece. That's sort of very, very light, so we can stiffen that up with some more pigment. Blue, got a bit more colour to it, so we can see what that looks like. That's starting to look a bit more useful for a flesh colour, a base flesh colour. So that's just a mixture, straightforward mixture of cadmium red, yellow ochre and cerulean blue, only a touch of cerulean blue. And that will dry lighter, of course. You have to remember that whilst acrylics dries a bit of a tone, half a tone darker, watercolour always dries lighter by as much, sometimes as a good full tone. So you can afford to be stronger than you expect, you can afford to be stronger with the application of the colour than you anticipate, so to allow for that reduction in the strength and saturation. Whilst it's wet, whilst the paint is wet, you can work in with a bit more colour. So just sort of check these, and that will then add and provide the means of starting to put darks in. If you want to highlight, you can lift pigment out. You can do this in fact when it's dry. Russell Flint, a famous watercolour painter of figures, used to use this, and it's paint through where the figures were and then create a little stencil and dab out. And for the darks, it's just a case of starting from the base mix. Just check it, see what it's like. Start from the base mix and add a little bit of burnt sienna in and a touch of ultramarine blue. And you can start to, it's a bit stronger, you can start to put darks in. I'm painting wet in wet here, and for a lot of the time you'll see with the demonstration of the actual portrait that I tend to not so much work wet in wet for putting the different tones of the face in. And if I did want to put a bit of, but if I did want to put a bit of tone in, a bit of interest, then drifting a bit of extra colour in is easy, wet in wet. What you have to remember is, what you mustn't do with watercolour is leave the paint to get to the position where it's just lost the surface shine, so it's still damp, not dried. And then if you go to put an adjacent colour in, you get sometimes the disaster of a bloom when one bit of paint will spread disastrously into another. Some people employ that quite deliberately. And this one doesn't seem to be, it's quite a critical balance of moisture content as to whether the bloom occurs. You can start to see it blooming on this side. It forms a sort of pattern. It's to do with the relative moisture of the different parts of the paint. In fact, the room here is quite warm, and that did dry out sufficiently for it to be able to put the paint at the side of it. So that's the basic mixing and applications of a wash, which forms as the starting point for a watercolour portrait. Just a bit of blue, that will stiffen it up a bit so we can get a bit of extra colour in there. That will be too dark for a base wash, but something like this will dry out. That bit lighter. It's really nice working with a big brush like this. Again, bringing a nice wet sloppy wash down. And in fact, this, although I've been pretty generous with the water, this paper has buckled very slightly, but it's not a disaster. In fact, this is a part of a pad that I've used, I use quite frequently if I'm doing any watercolour painting outside, because it's just about sort of weighty enough not to buckle too much to make it sort of difficult to paint on. So there we have the basis for the pigments and the colours for the start of a portrait.